In Floriani Fusion, you have the ability to add a grid to the background and also use guidelines. And notice here on the left-hand side is the option to turn on the grid. And so it's kind of an on or off situation with the grid. But if you want to interact with your grid settings, go over top of the ruler space and right click. And this is how you can first of all change your sort of program to measuring in metric versus measuring in inches. So that's an important thing to know. And then also from that menu, if you right click, you have the ability to turn on and off your grid, as well as go into the grid settings. And when you're creating, if you want, you can use options to snap to the grid or snap to the guidelines or snap to the anchors. And so first of all, let's look at the grid settings. So right now my grid is set so that every small square is 1/4 of 1 inch, and that every 8 squares there will be kind of a large purple line. You can take the control of those, so if you'd rather have small blue squares and red lines, that's entirely up to you. You can also change the size if you'd rather have 1/2 inch squares or 1 inch squares or any size that you want. You could choose that here. Also from here, how do you want the grid displayed? As solid lines, as dashed lines, or as kind of like dots? And finally, here are the check boxes for snap to kind of on and off. So if I say OK, you'll see my grid will change to be, blue dotted lines for the smaller squares and red lines for the larger squares. And so if those are 1/4 of an inch, and so every 4 of them is an inch and every 8 of them is 2 inches. So that means every red square is approximately 2 inches. Notice that if I turn on, for example, right click and I say snap to grid, and then if I use any of our creation tools, whether it be the rectangle or the pencil, they will snap to your grid. And so if I get anywhere near a grid line, it will automatically connect to it, and it makes it very easy to create the certain sizes. If you're in the middle, it'll allow you to make that size. But if you click anywhere close to the outline, it will snap to it. So it makes it easier to create, specific size squares and, or draw lines that way. And so you have snap to grid. A guideline, that's when you left click on the ruler and you drag. And so now I can add a guideline. I could have 2 guidelines and be like, I need a box that fits between those guidelines. And so I right click and I tell it to snap to guidelines and maybe even turn off snap to grid. So now I know that it's always going to snap to those guidelines if I get anywhere near them. So that's the idea, that you can take control of the grid. First of all, it's either displayed on or off. You also have a right click option to remove guidelines. So if you've drawn some guidelines and you want to get rid of them later, you can remove them that way. You can also, I'll drag a few on, you can bring them in from both the vertical and the horizontal ruler. And you can also pick them up and kind of move them. So after you've drawn them, if you use your select tool, you should be able to go on a guideline and like change its location. And if you select the guideline and drag it back to the ruler, that's another way to get rid of them, so to speak. So yeah, it's probably easier just to right click and say remove guidelines. And so that is how you can use your grid and your guidelines.